Welcome. Welcome to TPXimpact. Welcome to our discussion on foundational data and how it can help support better public services. So yeah, foundational data. People call it a lot of different things. We've picked that term, but also gets called basic data or registers or even reference data. It's kind of master data management across the whole public sector. But whatever you call it, it's a key part of different public services and different organizations working better together. And so that's the kind of topics that we want to explore. And it's something that we're very interested in at TPXimpact because a lot of our work is that kind of ecosystem of organizations working together and how data standards and data platforms and services and organizations can combine to deliver something useful for citizens. And so it's a key part which is always kind of there, but sometimes gets ignored. And so we want to give it the attention that it deserves. So joining up services is something that's been a kind of big part of the recent roadmap for digital government that's been published. And also, a lot of you have seen Richard Pope's book, Platform Land, where he talks about how a kind of once-only approach to data is a way to enable better services. And of course, it's one of the kind of key things that's one of the key objectives of the National Data Library, and we're all interested to see how that goes. And I think there was an update report published recently, but we're expecting our kind of broader strategy to be published later in the spring. But one of the things in that update report was commenting on how the National Data Library team have been learning what's been going on in other countries. So Estonia, Netherlands, Denmark are often highlighted as people who have a more formal approach to foundational data than in the UK. So it's interesting to learn how things work in different places. But so while we're waiting to see how the National Data Library team wants to approach that, and we're hoping that the momentum and funding that goes with that could be the kind of thing that makes a difference after we've all been talking about joining up data for donkey's years, that maybe there's a chance that we can make some key progress there. So in the meantime, we thought it was a good time to get people together and just kind of explore the topic, and we're delighted to have our panel of experts here to give us their opinions. So I'd like to introduce Charles Baird, from the Chief Data Architect at the Office for National Statistics, Jocelyn Palmer, who is the Programme Director for OneLondon, connecting up data across health and care in London, and Alex Coley, who is the Managing Director of Epimorphics, a company that looks at connected data for public and private sector organizations. So we will start with Charles.
Oh, good.
Huge picture. I'll click on to your name. And so each of our speakers is just going to give a few minutes lightning talk, kind of introduce yourselves and an opening statement of what you think is important in this area. Then we'll go to a panel discussion. And with a small group like this, let's keep it very informal. I've got a few things that I'll ask, but very keen to get thoughts and contributions from everyone here. So Charles, over to you.
Thanks very much. I should point out that I'm only going first because I was the last person to join the planning call yesterday. It's like punishment, basically. So hi, I'm Charles. I'm the Chief Data Architect at the ONS. Before that, I ran the data architecture team at GDS and CDDO. So I've got some form in this area. We would probably call it reference data if you're gonna choose a particular term for it. My teams at the ONS are responsible for some of our core data products. So an easy one to start with is geography. So we produce a lot of the statistical geographies for the government, which lots of people use, even though they pretend they don't, and that makes funding it a real fun thing every year. Yes, I'm in planning at the moment. That's a traditional reference data approach, right? Here is an authoritative thing about lookups between UPRNs and statistical geographies that people can download for free and add to their analysis. We do some other things which are a little bit less public facing, specifically to support ONS outputs. We build something we call the demographic index, which is a view of the population of the country that we can use to build models of the population, obviously, which we also then are able to use as a form of data linkage. It allows us to effectively index large data sets with people in them and then join them together in a much more efficient way. And I've just described it in the most boring way possible, but it is quite cool, I should point out. Similarly, we've got products like that for all of the organizations, businesses in the country, so joining up not just people who are registered at Companies House, but also sole traders and people who are paying tax as businesses, but weirdly haven't yet registered because they haven't got around to it, whatever. We can still bring them together and sample them. So when we're sending out our surveys to businesses across the country, we can get a proper representative sample. We're not held to the biggest companies, etc. So from my perspective, the foundational question is a little bit more complicated because there's often a bit of a well, it's a problem with vocabulary, right? We have this one-word data, and it describes a multitude of sins, right? The thing that I'm interested in is statistics, and how you're going to... It's not really the only thing I'm interested in, I can assure you. But there's a kind of three-speed approach in my mind to it, where you've got statistics and outputs like that on one end, and for that we need the very highest quality data. You've got, on the other end, transactional data, which allows the building of services, and oftentimes that's the conversation we're having. But there's also something in the middle around getting the right data in place to do better analysis. So you don't need to have 5 nines accuracy in your data sets to be able to do policy analysis, to do targeted interventions in winter fuel payments or things like that. What you need is good enough data, and that's one of the things we're working on quite a lot, to understand what will allow that analysis and how you can communicate the differences in quality for various things. So you can tell I haven't prepared because that was incredibly rambling. At some point in the questions, I'll probably remember what I meant to say. But it is really important. I do think there is this, what tends to happen, and what I'd like to steer the conversation away from is, we think that there is going to be one big data program that solves everything. So there's the National Data Library. I worked on the Integrated Data Service at the ONS, still do. Before the National Data Library, there was the Government Data Exchange and the Data Marketplace. And there is this kind of tendency to go, oh, why don't you just use that thing that's going to solve all the data problems? And where I'd like to get us to is it's a slightly more complicated situation than that. And there are going to be horses for courses. And maybe we can talk about that later when I stop hogging the mic.
Thanks very much, Charles. I think that's sets the scene nicely. Joss, I'll pass on to you, and I'll just pass you the clicker because you have a couple of slides.
So, hello, I'm Jocelyn Palmer, and I'm part of OneLondon. So I thought it would be helpful, just a little bit of scene setting. OneLondon is almost like a bit of a brand that we use when we're doing collaborative work across the NHS in London. And at the heart of it is, how do we share information? So I guess our kind of landscape from an NHS perspective is that we have these NHS administrative boundaries, and London is kind of divided into currently 5 integrated care systems, or ICSs, covering a population of kind of up to a couple of million. But kind of looking at the types of organisations and the variation, I mean, there are I think over 1,300 GP practices. There are kind of 35 plus hospital trusts. And in terms of the main IT or electronic care record systems, at least sort of 35 big ones that are used. And none of those things really kind of talk to each other or are connected. So that quote there from Branwen, who's someone that I've kind of met and spoken to a few times, is about her cancer care and her treatment, because she lived in one part of London and received care for her cancer in 2 other parts of London. And it wasn't great. And sadly, that's not that uncommon as an experience. And some of you might have had that, or you might have had friends and family. And I think if we kind of look at the data around our patient pathways, at least 30% of people will live in one part of London and receive care in another. So these sort of silos of organisational systems and barriers really don't serve, better and more efficient and effective care. So these are some of the programmes of work that we're doing across OneLondon in different sorts of ways. So, and it's a range of different things. It's not just kind of, to your point, just one thing that kind of does everything. So health data for research, we've got a London secure data environment that is in the process of being created, all the way through to, a care planning tool, the Universal Care Plan, which is about real-time care plans for a person, whether it's to do with frailty or sickle cell or end-of-life wishes. And then we've got a very long-standing London Care Record, which is a shared care record, quite a basic read-only record, bringing together data from across health and care. But it's used by about 100,000 staff. And I think we're kind of getting to maybe about 3 million views a month. So it's kind of well used. And our probably most recent work is looking at how we digitise a very paper-based Mental Health Act. So that's a process around when people are sectioned. So that's a kind of range of some of the things that we have been doing in London, all because of that kind of, the picture that I painted initially. And some of you may have heard of I guess a kind of government announcement around creating a single patient record. And this has some really admirable aims, and a lot of the problem statements behind it, fully recognise and it's, similar things drive OneLondon. And I guess, we're here to talk about some of the kind of foundational data and the importance of that. And I guess that is going to be really key to the success of something like a national single patient record. And I think we have some elements that possibly could be building blocks around it. We have an NHS number, we have a patient demographic system, there are things like that. But I guess my experience in OneLondon is just about that. It's just, we're not starting from a perfect greenfield site. It's imperfect and it's messy, and there's things that have been done historically, and so I guess I'm really interested in and keen also to hear your thoughts and perspectives on how do we create foundational data that for the NHS, on the NHS or by the NHS, and how we can create something when we are starting from the position that we're in.
Thanks, Joss. That's great. And pass on to Alex.
Thanks, Bill. Oh, God, yeah, horrible photo. So Alex Coley, Epimorphics Managing Director. I kind of worked in government for, like 16 years, very much on the kind of coalface of using and managing data, and sort of jumped ship 10 years ago to the private sector, working, to some extent as Bill highlighted, a technology SME based out in Bristol, working with public and private sector in the kind of space of I guess what's often called fair data, so very much the accessible, interoperable, reusable data side of things, and that's kind of often working in the kind of, I guess similar again to Charles, I'd probably go for the kind of reference data end of the spectrum. So very much the kind of reference data alongside kind of policy and operational data to make that accessible and reusable, with some organisations like HM Land Registry. We do the UK House Price Index and the price paid data, which is used quite actively by, the sorts of people who are interested in house price numbers, right? So, insurance companies and house sales companies. And we work with Environment Agency with hydrology data. So that's river level information, kind of large volumes of data there being used by kind of researchers, hydrologists, European Space Agency types for ground truthing and universities and so on, and Food Standards Agency with data like registers of regulated products. So that's the kind of what's allowed to be in food and that type of information alongside product recall data. So quite a range of different things. And often that data is using, what we would call reference data. And it's a lot easier when that's in place and thought about with over the long term. So when you start to grow out, kind of multiple services that are using similar sorts of data, you can start kind of reusing that reference data. And I think the challenge has been many kind of services that have got kind of data built within them. If they haven't thought about that reference data for the long term, separate from the individual kind of silos of those services, it becomes something that ends up being duplicated. So trying to avoid that, I guess, it's the kind of reference data isn't always the sexy part of a project, right? So it kind of gets sort of forgotten about or not costed in. And actually what you see is the sort of challenge across organizations where they haven't thought about that long term. So how are you going to understand who the users of the reference data is so that you can demonstrate that it's actually being used? So we've seen services over there's quite a few examples where those sorts of numbers haven't really been thought about, and they've used kind of website hit statistics, which isn't necessarily a good way of understanding the sorts of users of reference data. So they haven't necessarily then justified the ongoing maintenance of them. And if you're a private sector company that might be innovating on top of that data, are you going to trust it if it's not going to exist for the long term? And actually other bits of government as well. If it's not going to be there and you've built your service to rely on it, that's not a good outcome, right? So it's getting that underlying trust from a kind of broad user community side in place. And I think that's kind of, I think it's known widely, but it's not something that we've necessarily seen across the board. And I think that, kind of as a kind of lesson from the sort of long history of the kind of working in this space is something we would like to see.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I guess that actually fits in quite well to the question I'd scribbled down as one to kick things off for a discussion is, and maybe you could have a go at answering this first, Alex. What can we learn from all of the initiatives, past and perhaps current, that have tried to tackle different aspects of this? And what's worked, what's not worked? The things that haven't worked, what do you think is the underlying reason? So there's, thinking like GDS registers, or, I'll say it, postcode address file. Or maybe newer things like the National Underground Asset Register, or there's been a lot of things, and some of them are still going. But obviously, I'm not looking for a comprehensive analysis, but just kind of pick a couple of things that strike you of what can we learn from all of that?
Good set of examples. I think, to some extent for me, data's much better managed close to where it originates. So I think the idea of sort of, there's going to be one single place that you put all of these things, I'm pretty skeptical of that. So when things have worked, it's where there's been, the organisation that creates that data has got a good sense of what it's for their purpose, and recognising, more broadly how it could be useful for other people, and that they've got some commitment to that for the long term. And that commitment goes with understanding how you're going to sustainably fund it. So although it might be free, ideally, there's a lot of a benefit to that, but understanding that it's going to have to be funded, and what you can't have is really critical national reference infrastructure that hasn't got that underlying funding in place, because it will disappear. And there was a period of time where some of the really useful reference data that surfaced through the register work was really valuable, and then it disappeared. And there were, a number of services across government that were built to rely on those things existing. Now, they weren't hitting that reference data on a daily basis so that it was detectable, by the people who were managing those services.
What do you think of from the NHS perspective, Joss? I think the NHS organisation data service might stand out as a success in foundational data, but that's just seen from the outside. It might be a bit different inside, and obviously that's only one small part of all of the things that you do. What do you think you would stand out as both a success story or perhaps something to learn from in the world of NHS foundational data?
So I guess thinking about that in terms of data, but also I guess a kind of infrastructure and standards around foundations. There was work done around the National Programme for IT, which does come in for a lot of criticism or portrayal as a failure, but things like setting up, the spine and some of the demographics that sit alongside that, I think has just been something that underpins a lot of the work that we do. So there are lots of things where we would want to learn lessons from that and not repeat them. And some of that is actually coming up through the single patient record programme. But I think, that there have been, good things that have been built. But I do, your point there about the kind of closeness and the proximity. I think often with NHS data as well, trust is a huge thing with the public. So that becomes a feature, as in people tend to trust much more something that feels close, their hospital or their GP, whereas something that feels very national or very abstract causes concern, sometimes for good reason.
And Charles, which scars are the deepest for you?
I don't think I'm allowed to talk about that. So I completely agree about data staying as close to the producer as possible. There's a couple of things. One is that there's an unfortunate tendency to combine this notion of reference data with open data. So there are lots of things so we use the Personal Demographics Service to do a lot of population-based analysis. We use data from HMRC, from DWP that comes in regularly that, takes a little bit of manhandling now and again. But in general, we've got that down. So there is a gap between just because these things aren't necessarily made available to the public or to other users, they are still there and being well managed. That there is a kind of foundational infrastructure we can call on. I do think that at the end of the day, the person who's going to manage it best over the long term is the person who's going to use it most, and probably that's therefore the register's experience of bringing everything centrally and not necessarily putting the responsibility for that in the right place feels like it paints a lesson. But equally, we'd say quite a lot of data we bring in and then transform and then turn into another bit of reference data, and that's probably the right place. So it's a complicated landscape. I do think that there's something to be said for looking at the positives that came out of some of these, big IT programs of any kind don't have an amazing success rate, not just in government. It's newsflash. Most of those things that are either still going and are producing value or produce some really interesting lessons, right? I think there's a whole generation of us who work in government data who enjoyed the experience of registers and have learned many lessons from it. So hopefully that does push us in the right direction.
So we obviously don't have a single definitive population register in the UK, but that's because we've got plenty of population registers, and I know some of the work that you've been doing with RDMF is a way of kind of cross-referencing those, and DWP and HMRC managed to swap lots of data successfully. So I mean, it's not that it can't happen, but if we look at other countries, like the kind of famous Estonia, who seem to do everything in a beautiful, well-organized way with IT, and examples like Denmark and the Netherlands, they're set up so that they have the processes to manage a single definitive population register. What do you think can we learn things from that? Is it sensible to try and get there from here, or is that just is it not better? It's just different. What are your thoughts on that? And why don't you go first,
Pretty
Joe?
sure I slipped you a tenner not to ask me about population registers. This is the point in a recorded thing where I have to make very clear that I'm speaking in a personal capacity and not on behalf of the Office for National Statistics. I don't think that a population register is ever going to work for the UK. I think we've had that battle and lost it. I think it's a lot more of a cultural thing than it is a technical thing. You could look at Estonia, who did have a couple of advantages in that they were starting from the greenfield position, and also there's 1.3 million of them. Right, so it's an easier thing to do. In the country,
just saying that the Netherlands has got a similar history to the UK and a more similar size, and they've made it work.
And I do, but I think that the thing they've made work there is that they have very much involved it with all their infrastructure. So the famous stat about the Netherlands and the census is, it costs us quite a lot of money to run a census, do it every 10 years, mobilise 50,000 people to do it. In the Netherlands, it takes 2 weeks and costs 14 quid or something. That's not a real stat. And that's because they've got an effective national identity thing, and therefore they can call it in. I think that, for lots of reasons, if we fix the infrastructure first and fix the kind of cultural things that would have to enable it, then maybe. But I don't think, and one of the reasons why we build alternatives, and I think we should be looking at how you can effectively build alternatives, is that would be a massive change program that would take years, if not decades, and therefore what are you going to do in the meantime?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Joss, it's easy for people like us to kind of geek out about data, but members of the public don't really care. They care about how they experience services. And what do you think what's the key thing to deliver actual better joined up services, whether in the NHS or whether it's kind of health and care or whether it's any of the other many services that local authorities are responsible for? What are the blockers to actually delivering services to citizens, do you think?
So when we talk about data around patient care, then I guess there are a couple of aspects that we can mention, which I kind of talked about within the OneLondon context. But I think if you went anywhere in the country, it would be the same type of focus. So part of that would be around looking at data from, from the perspective of maybe wanting to know, let's analyze it. Let's understand different cohorts. Let's try to understand my patients at my practice or in my neighbourhood who are at risk of X or Y. So that kind of understanding of risks and being able to cohort patients so that you can, in theory, direct care and plan care effectively, whether it's at a service level or at a patient level. And I guess for an individual person, then what matters really is that, if our care is quite straightforward, then it's kind of fine how things are. It might not be terribly modern, but it works. But if you're somebody who you have been to emergency department, or if you need to use multiple different services, maybe you have some support in the community or some nursing support, or you receive care from a mental health trust and as well as your local GP, then it's just really important that your information kind of goes with you. And that's what it typically doesn't do, because the NHS isn't one organisation, because we are fractured into, and the systems don't kind of talk to each other. So I think that's what a lot of the NHS focus is, and it's kind of oftentimes with that example around kind of the information following you, it's messy, it's not clean reference data, it's structured as well as unstructured, it's narrative as well as kind of facts and figures. But I think that's I think from the perspective of, if I'm receiving care, what would I want? It's people to know enough about my history so I don't have to repeat my story the whole time, and, so that my care can be appropriate and well managed.
And can I invite questions from the audience? I've got plenty more things that I could talk to these interesting folks about, but we're a small group. Let's keep it informal. Who'd like to make a point or ask a question?
I'm not sure. point or a question. Right. I'm really interested that all of you have talked about the different elements that need to be in play, but no one's really talked about what it costs to produce good quality data. And I think, all our public services produce a hell of a lot of data. Data is free in that sense because it's being produced all the time. But in order to be useful and usable, it needs to be good quality, and good quality data costs, because Joss mentioned standards and, and flowing. And so I'm interested in, I should have said who I was probably, shouldn't I? I work for the Local Government Association. My name's Juliet Butler. I'm really interested in how councils who give a lot of data but aren't paid for it, but are required to submit it in certain standards, and then it's not even licensed. So central government or others take their data, they make businesses around it, nothing flows back. They have no control. You can see I'm starting to get on my soapbox. Land Registry took some of their data around homes and properties. They've now set up a service where you can get a lot of it free. So one authority told me they've lost £500,000 for data they used to charge for, and now they don't get because people are using the free service. This undermines them keeping good quality data. How do we support the data providers to be able to invest in improving data? Potentially, there's more data if only that money was, there was some money available for them to invest in their own data.
Yeah, Alex, so you were talking about the importance of kind of long-term commitment to these services. So what do you think on the topic of, what does it cost, who pays, and how do you make that sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one. I think part of the challenge, how much does it cost? It's sort of a how long's a piece of string question to some extent, but it's really about understanding the whole end-to-end ecosystem and actually recognizing the value within that ecosystem and properly demonstrating that from an economics point of view. I think many of us that have kind of worked in the kind of data sector community have probably not been economists, and I think you can have those discussions around trying to put a value on a data set or a data set service, and there are lots of different ways of doing that, and you can do it from a capital investment type angle, and you can use that and say, to maintain that asset, there's a certain percentage that you should have funding to maintain that asset, or you can look at it from what's the value for the public sector as a whole, and I mean, I've seen some methods for that one can be quite sceptical about the numbers, and sometimes because the method isn't necessarily very well described. But I think, collectively as a community, I think coming up with some better ways of describing those costs and benefits that can kind of demonstrate that. And I think we've seen, there are examples in other countries where more of that is done, and sometimes it's also around what's the kind of benefit to the particular country as a whole in the influence that it gets from more people using this data, and that is factored in to the overall cost, and then making sure that the people that are ultimately part of that ecosystem get a fair whack of that money. It's not fair if it's just the end organisation that gets it.
Charles,
I was going to say, I do think we should understand how government works and find the levers that pull. All right, so there is how do you demonstrate the value of this, and how do you speak to the outcomes and therefore get the funding that it requires, right? And I don't know how you do that because I've been trying for ages. And it's not gone amazingly well. I do think there is something we could learn from the private sector here in that I've been doing this for about 5 years now. Before that, was the private sector for a long time. Anything that isn't showing value or return on investment is kind of ruthlessly cut. And that was a bit of a killer if you worked in data, because it sometimes takes quite a long time to show ROI from here is some analysis, which might push us into. But there has been a big kind of socio-technical movement in the enterprise data world where it thinks about how you empower teams to produce data and how you then fund them for it and how you think of that as a cost that needs to be borne for the benefits for the business. It is a hard thing to translate across government, which is definitely not an enterprise in any way. But there's probably something there to explore.
Thomas, you put your hand up earlier. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, it might form into a question. Let's see. Do you remember about 6-9 months ago, maybe even longer, a lot of excitement around the idea of a kind of digital policy readiness checklist concept that was going to be potentially piloted in the UK, which was very successful in Denmark. The idea that embedded within actually the kind of writing of legislation, you can set sort of, I suppose you could even set foundational data definitions in legislation, which is consistent between legislation, which then means that as acts become law, embedded in the policy and any service that comes from it, you've got the foundations in place, which I thought was quite an exciting thing, not a shiny product or a shiny sort of service like the National Data Library, but a thing that would sort of spread its tentacles into the actual mechanism of government itself. And it went really quiet. So I was just interested if anyone had heard anything about that, because it feels like a really interesting lever that could sort of set the idea of consistent high quality data into policy making, but it went very quiet. Question to the panel and others.
I haven't heard about that, and therefore I will make a point about something else in the way of panels, in the way of panels the world over.
And also, just to highlight, if anyone in the audience has anything to add on that, then do jump in as well.
One of the things that has been quite successful over the last few years is that we started to get things like API by default into commercial agreements, right, which has been a massive improvement in that you expect suppliers now to build an API for your service, right? And it used to be, it turns out that's extra, right? So getting it into contracts has been game changing in a way. So it does sound like a really useful thing. I think that one of the problems is always time and definition. So I know this room won't understand it, but not everyone likes data or talking about data standards. I don't understand it. But quite hard to get that into a policy team's mind in such a way that it is then useful down the line, right? So this is historically, and for a long time, it took a few goes to get the commercial thing right, because it wasn't being worded very well in contracts, and it wasn't necessarily getting the outcome we wanted, and therefore it iterated. So it does sound like it's the kind of thing that does sound quite exciting, but I'd probably caution if and when it comes, it'll take a little while to land.
I mean, part of why it's successful in Denmark is the rules that are kind of plugged into the policy spit directly into the technical solution that runs most of Denmark's services, and it's one supplier, and it's a big dominant supplier, so it's not necessarily a world that we want to move to, but perhaps some kind of flexibility in that meant that there's more of an open market for that. Back
in the day when I had to do data architecture for a living rather than just telling people what to do, I worked with a team at whatever became, I think, Baird, because it was a few years ago, before DBT, who were building out the open regulation standard and portal, which was based on the legislation.gov.uk, where machine readable, standardized, which is a similar kind of thing where you want to be able to put regulation in such a way that it can be consumed by corporate systems and say, this is how you can, and it does feel like there's a kind of underpinning backbone of useful reference. I mean, that, regulations are data in their own way. That is a foundational data asset.
I'm Mark from VDF. I wrote large chunks of blueprint that I think I'm referring to in that. I think we've sort of given up on trying to do it in generality.
Interesting.
But I think the principles of it and how we do bits of it here and there in things is still very current. I think trying to solve it in generality is really hard. Like trying to tell policy what to do and ministers what to do. That's what it comes down to. Yeah. There's not an easy way of doing that. And I think the feeling was basically do it incrementally, lots of individual things, much more easily and quickly than we could do some sort of Denmark got this kind of general law and a body and a reference body and thing, and it's all kind of,
it's very institutional.
Yeah, I think the institutional bit is really slow.
Yeah,
and you can do a lot of things a lot quicker than the institutional bit. So theory is actually let's do it in an individual kind of, point at data in the right way in law. A lot of things that are quicker than the institutionalisation of it is given up on the really big picture around it. But
Interesting.
that's not to say it's not still happening.
Yeah.
So maybe just like one final question, and then we can move to informal chat and beer. I guess on that topic, and maybe a quick thought from each of our panelists, which things should be centralised, and which things shouldn't? Okay.
Careful how you answer.
I think we're all agreed that if you try and centralise everything, you're doomed to failure. If you centralise nothing, then you've got chaos. Where's that balance? In five words, Charles.
Happy days. So on the principle of data should stay, ideally, if I could, wave a magic wand and get whatever I wanted from data, it would stop moving around. We would interrogate data in place. We would have data owned by the original producer. We would have common standards and access patterns so that you could get real-time access to data sets within operational things, and we'd have worked out how you deal with latency and burden on operational systems at the time. That feels like it's, something of a pipe dream. But if anyone can fix it, that'd be great. But I still think that the way you get there is through a strong and empowered standards agency who can actually hold people to account, right? So I would like to see that kind of, probably shouldn't use aggressive in the word in a kind of governance sense, but empowered, let's say, empowered standard setting and crucially. Implementation checking. So I'd really like to see the service, the data elements of the service standard built back up, and for new services have to pass. Are you using the right standards? Are you using the right patterns for accessing data to be able to get funding? Now, that isn't the question you asked, but again, I decided to answer a different one.
GDS service assessments for data. Yeah, maybe. Joss, central or not?
Oh. I kind of winced when you asked that question. So it does make a lot of sense, I think, for there to be certain things which are like nationally the same or which support it. So, like if there wasn't an NHS number, just imagine like how much worse things would be. I feel, and maybe this picks up a bit on your point around, and also what you said around the standards. So there is a lot of conversation from a legislative point of view, but also just a, I guess, commercial and how do we procure perspective on interoperability and standards around exchange. So I feel as though actually I'm a supporter of innovation and like the idea of like smaller companies that can provide and support care in the NHS. I think is brilliant. But what's hard is when things are very much there's a kind of a lock-in or a vendor lock-in, and so I think moving away from that is something that I would be supportive of. So kind of core national services and national platforms that support how information is shared when it needs to be shared, but then which also allows flexibility locally and choice.
And Alex, a final word, a brief one.
I'll be brief. So I think there is definitely some cross-cutting data that ought to be looked after centrally, right? Or like identifiers of organisations in government, that kind of thing would be nice. But maybe just a slight addition, possibly not always centrally managed, but maybe centrally funded for things that are cross-cutting.
Thanks very much. That's a good point to end on. So let's carry on the chat informally, but before we do that, please say thank you to our splendid speakers. And if I can borrow the clicker back. Try not to trip over my cable. We've got a couple of just brief adverts. If you want to hear see the slides in the recording from today, or to hear about other events that are coming up, there is a code there. and I'll leave this up afterwards. And also, we're starting to do a podcast called The Transformation Tapes. So if you would like to either listen to that, or if you or a friend would like to be a guest on it, then do please get in touch. And there's a link there. So just to say thanks very much for everyone who braved the weather to come out tonight. And it's been very interesting for me, and I hope for all of you. Let's carry on chatting informally. Thank you.